Good afternoon, Chuck Morse here, Left Right Radio, every afternoon at 12 noon. And my guest is Keith Whittington. He is the William Nelson Cromwell Professor of Politics at Princeton University. He's the author of Political Foundations of Judicial Supremacy, the Presidency, the Supreme Court, and Constitutional Leadership in U.S. History, among other really amazing texts. Keith, thanks for joining me this afternoon.
Thanks for having me.
Keith, I wanted, first of all, get into a very critical but rather dreary subject that you have probably some firsthand knowledge on, and that is the phenomena of, I don't want to use the word campus censorship, but there has been an atmosphere that has prevailed on America's main liberal campuses that, let's just say, it severely discourages alternative, conservative, libertarian, and other type speech. And it does so not necessarily in the formal sense, but through various intimidation tactics. Can you talk a little bit on that and on your own observations?
Yeah, I think that's certainly true. I think it's a problem that's more severe on some campuses than on other campuses. So I don't think it's a universal problem, but it's a real problem. And it can take multiple forms. So I think one set of concerns is sort of these very high profile, visible displays of intolerance toward outside speakers, people being shouted down, such as the example of Charles Murray at Middlebury. And that doesn't happen all that often. They get a lot of attention when it does happen. It's discouraging, but it is certainly sort of an effort, I think, by campus activists to really be very visible in saying, here's the limits as to what we're willing to tolerate on this campus. And they happen to express it in the context of an outside speaker. I think the other thing that's much more common but also much less visible and harder to deal with ultimately is self-censorship by students in the classrooms and elsewhere, where students are just very hesitant to express their own views given concerns about how other students will receive that. They have to live with those students on a college campus, and as a consequence, they're often, I think, less worried about what their professor is going to think and more worried about what their fellow students are going to think. And as a consequence, I think a lot of students are very cautious about what they're willing to say in the classroom, and I suspect it extends well beyond the classroom into other contexts as well on campus.
Well, there does seem to be the obvious social pressure to conform to liberal points of view. I think that it even ratchets up a little bit more in that several campuses have put in these, I guess they call them by different names. I mean, at Tufts University, where I was broadcasting until they gave me a new slot, 3 o'clock in the morning, and then so I eventually left. They called it anti-bias police, right, or anti-bias office, which somebody reported me to because I made a very mild statement about something that offended someone. And I'm very aware of, in loco parentis and being very careful that I am talking on a private college campus. So it was nothing particularly extreme, but I expressed conservative views on different issues. And I think that with the existence of these sorts of offices, I know that other colleges have them as well, it really is sending a rather chilling message to students because they can be reported to this office and they can lose I suppose they can be kicked out of school, they can lose their reputation. I mean, when you have, your parents are spending $60 grand a year to send you to these institutions, nobody needs that. So there's a tendency, maybe it's subconscious even, to just sort of keep your head low and not express anything that might inadvertently get someone else's nose bent out of shape.
Yeah, I think a number of campuses are installing these kinds of systems and putting them in place. And at least that can be controlled by the administration. So they ought to be thoughtful about how they design these things, whether they adopt them at all. I think some of them are better than others. So there's some that can come with disciplinary consequences. So those systems are really designed to be able to sanction students, and that's often students in particular. And in the extreme cases, expel students from campus, but often less extreme sanctions. And some of them are really designed and they're sort of pitched as if they're educational. So they don't necessarily get tied to a disciplinary structure. They aren't necessarily empowered with the ability to actually punish students, but instead it does lead to students getting called down to an office and talked to about the inappropriate things they said. And of course, that's very chilling as well. I think some students, once they realize that's as far as it can go, slough it off. But other students, I think, then become very cautious about what they're willing to say because they don't want to get called down to the principal's office.
Right, of course. And this is exactly, of course, the opposite of what we conventionally think college experience is supposed to be all about, especially if you're studying political science or law, where you need to have a vigorous debate on all sides of an issue, and you need to feel free enough to have the debate and not worry about someone, starting to, crawl into a fetal position and cry and accuse you of things. I mean, nobody wants to be accused of these horrors, like, a claim that you might be racist because, there's some micro, managing, I guess they call it microaggression, where they put you under a microscope and try to find a racist gene. I mean, it's not even a matter of anything you said. It's more how you might look at somebody, or you can't know. I mean, it seems to me the most tyrannical program I've seen come down the pike. And I know it was patented in the 1990s by Harvard professor Charles Pierce, who first started the theory of microaggression. But now it's reached the point where, it's the ultimate form of control, that you have to worry about not just even what you think, but what somebody might think you're thinking. I mean, I can't imagine anything more totalitarian. How can students stand up to this?
Well, it's difficult, and I think you're right to say it's the sort of worst possible situation is when you have these systems that are designed to report people and what they do in class. So it's sort of one thing if you imagine students getting in arguments and fights in a dorm, for example, and being able to bring in residential assistants or somebody else in order to help arbitrate that. But it's another thing when students are reporting on what each other said in a classroom, where a professor is there supervising that conversation, and suddenly you have administrators involved, second guessing how you were conducting a class effectively, and what kinds of arguments students can make in class. And so I think the worst kinds of abuses on these fronts, whether it's the older hate speech codes or these more recent incident bias teams and the like, is the effort to say certain kinds of academic arguments that you might be exploring in the classroom or in student papers, for example, are unacceptable, and run afoul of some administrator somewhere that's going to challenge them. I think universities have to be very aggressive. Faculty need to be very aggressive in pushing back against that and resisting that. The microaggression thing, I think, is a real concern. It often is tied into these bias incident teams as a way of that's precisely not what people were intending to say necessarily, but how somebody received what might have been in other circumstances seemed like an innocuous comment, but somebody's offended by it, and they report it up the chain to administrators. And again, I think universities have to be extraordinarily cautious before they discipline students in particular. And I think they need to be very careful about how they train administrators that have responsibilities to help supervise students so that they are not overly aggressive in trying to enforce some of these ideas.
But yet they're not doing that. I mean, it seems like these ideas and these programs, as it were, have really achieved a high ground on many and increasing numbers of campuses. And it's also used as a bludgeon, I think, by liberal left groups to really push around groups that don't conform to their point of view. I'd specifically mention the phenomena of the anti-Israel movement, not just the Palestinian movement, that's okay, but this Jewish Voice for Peace, which demands that Hillel, which is a pro-Israel Jewish group, let them come in, and that they can't have pro-Jewish, pro-Israel speakers.
Right.
It's really a terrible phenomenon. I know that here in Boston, where I am, I've spoken to the administrator of the Hillel at BU, and they basically said they didn't get anywhere here. We just hit them off with a stick. But in some of the smaller campuses, they're making major inroads. And, I've only used that as one example of many that could be cited. These radical left groups tend to do what's called intersectionality, where they sort of flock together with other radical left groups. And if one group is criticized, then they all kind of use their group force. I hate to use the word collective, but they use that force to silence the opposition. And I'm fearful that not only is this happening on college campuses, but it's happening in corporations, it's happening in businesses, and it's happening in everyday life.
Yeah, I think it's expanding off of college campuses. As with many other things, ideas that start off on college campuses, sets of practices and institutions that start on college campuses can expand into the wider world. And one of the challenges on campuses, and I think it's a similar challenge that corporations and other organizations face as well, is these things often fly under the radar. They're separated out from the main parts of the organization. So in a university context, for example, the administrators who are in charge of developing these programs and implementing them often are completely unknown to the faculty. Faculty aren't paying any attention to them. Senior campus leadership often isn't paying attention to them, so they have their sort of autonomous lines of authority and operate pretty independently in lots of ways, and then only come to the attention of others on campus when a particular scandal breaks. So I think, in particular, senior university leadership needs to be particularly self-conscious about paying attention to these kinds of administrative lines and programs and how they're behaving, because otherwise they can, I hate to use the word fester, but fester under the surface, and then only become visible when there's a real problem. And I think likewise, corporations and others are sort of in a similar bind, that things can be developing in HR departments and elsewhere where you're not paying attention to them. They sort of become routinized, institutionalized, and then next thing you know, there's a particularly visible scandal that occurs, and suddenly everybody becomes aware of something that's been going on all along in the background the whole time.
And I think I should also caution even liberals who might be watching this, that if you start to go down this fascistic path, these sorts of organizations and these sorts of modalities can be used against you. If you have somebody has a vendetta against you, they don't like you, or they want to push you aside and elbow in, themselves into a position, all of a sudden you could become a target of this. It's like once you have this particular kind of mindset, which is very typical, by the way, of communist countries. And take a look at communist China. They have, like a block leader who keeps an eye on the neighborhood and makes sure that people don't go out, go off the path in terms of political correctness. I interviewed somebody who was a survivor of Nazi Germany. They did this as well. If you said something that was even slightly off the mark in terms of criticizing the Nazi regime, you could get a visit by a police, and in that case, it was the Gestapo. You had these organizations were formalized, they were nationalized, they were part of the apparatus of the government itself. I'm not suggesting we've reached that point, but you have this mindset, this acceptance of this kind of authoritarianism that can open the door to that, and then in a small way lead to it with many small examples that we might begin to get comfortable with. So I guess that, Keith, my question to you, as someone who has written extensively about civil liberties and the Constitution and our way of life, is what can we do as conservatives, libertarians, open-minded, well-meaning liberals to counter this?
Well, I think you're right to point out that it's not simply a left-right issue. And so conservatives become very vocal about free speech issues lately. But I'm in some ways optimistic because I think a lot of liberals on college campuses and off college campuses are seeing some of the problems. And often liberals are increasingly becoming the target of a lot of these campaigns. And so I think one thing that's important is to build a broader coalition on campuses and off campuses in support of free speech and support of the core mission of the university of engaging in skeptical inquiry and wide-ranging debate. I think there are coalitions to be built. I think it's important not to simply characterize these as an issue that's only of concern to conservatives or those who are on the right, because it shouldn't be, and ultimately it'll be more effective if it's not characterized that way. I think it particularly is important, I think, for senior leadership on college campuses to be focusing on these ideas. I think increasingly they are. I think there's some of these high-profile incidents like the Middlebury incident with Charles Murray or some of the Berkeley incidents have opened a lot of people's eyes to problems on campuses. And as a consequence, I think college presidents are fairly open to thinking about this seriously and pushing back. And I think donors and alumni can be effective in helping to encourage them to think about that. I hope actually this can be dealt with at sort of a campus level rather than necessarily involving state legislatures, for example, in trying to intervene in campus politics. I think that's often going to be fairly ham-fisted and have a lot of bad consequences as well as potentially some good consequences. So it'd be much better if campus presidents and senior leadership take the lead in pushing these issues and really insisting that universities pursue their core mission of pursuing the truth wherever it may go, and that leads to people being able to articulate controversial ideas on college campuses.
Right, and obviously the bigger the problem becomes, and you get the government involved, it becomes much worse. I would hope that in such conflicts where someone feels offended that somebody said something, those things can be handled in the classroom. Or they could be handled directly between the two parties rather than turn it into like a weapon, to weaponize these things on the campus level or even outside the campus where you could have, a situation where you have all of a sudden investigation. Here in Boston, for example, we had, there was a minor incident where someone made a racially insensitive comment on a website several years ago, and there was a couple of other things that happened that really could have been handled on the campus. But these two young women set up a Facebook page talking about it. And they didn't even mean it to become a big deal, but the Boston Globe picked up on it. Before you know it, they had 3 agencies, a federal, state, and local, investigating this high school and going in, and there was headlines, and it was like, oh my God, they're racist. And this is one of the most, by the way, racially diverse high schools in the state. I mean, so these things can become weaponized, and they can be used as a way to really blow something way out of proportion, and it sends a message to your average student that you better be quiet. You better be, you better not say anything, because nobody wants to see their name in the paper, and nobody wants to. These organizations and this trend really could ruin a person's life. They could ruin their career. And once they're in place, it's very hard to combat this and to counteract it.
Yeah, no, I think they clearly can blow up and escape campus itself and become much more visible public controversies. I think some of the challenge is ultimately going to have to be addressed below the college level. That is, people in primary and secondary schools need to be trying to encourage students to figure out ways of working out their own problems rather than simply trying to report to an administrator and expect the administrator to always intervene. I think students at a fairly young age need to be cautioned about how they use social media and the like. Some of the habits of how students communicate, but also some of the habits of how students expect to be treated is really developed earlier before they get to college. And then it's a tough challenge to get them out of the mindset of, well, what was appropriate when you were 12 years old How should you be thinking now when you're 18, 19, 20-year-olds and you're on a college campus? And colleges have a role to play in trying to get those students to recognize that they are older adults, and there are certain expectations that come along with that. I think it'd be helpful as well if at earlier grades, schools sort of began that process of trying to get students to be thinking about how are they going to live their lives outside of high school, outside of middle school.
That's right. And I think that it's safe to say that there is a war on campuses against conservative and libertarian thought. David Horowitz from the Horowitz Freedom Center has done a lot of work on this, and he's personally toured campuses and gives a lot of testimonial on it. There's a situation here in Boston, again, where I am, where there was funding by a libertarian group, a freedom project group, by the Koch brothers. And then there's this organization they call themselves the Uncoke the Campus, that made a publicity fanfare over it, and they ended up trying to shut it down. And whether they're successful remains to be seen. But, it's like the Koch brothers are funding civil libertarian groups. I mean, what's wrong with that? I mean, they won't talk about the fact that maybe George Soros, who's a man of the far left, is funding groups like this Jewish Voices for Peace. I mean, I don't know. I mean, there's rumors about that. I'm not stating that, but I'm just saying that when you have a conservative group or a libertarian group, they're the ones who are put under this kind of spotlight, as if there's something evil about them getting money from the Koch brothers, who, by the way, they're not particularly conservative. I mean, they were the main funders in New York State of the gay marriage initiative. So they tend to be, libertarian oriented. And this idea of purging them from campuses, it's very chilling, in my opinion, to have that happen.
Yeah, there's a bit of mixed things, I think, with the Koch Foundation and its funding. Some of it, I think, as you say, is simply an intolerance of ideas that are regarded as sort of outside the mainstream of academia. And fighting the Koch brothers is part of that effort to really say that conservative and libertarian ideas aren't necessarily welcome on campus. And I think faculty administrators ought to push back strongly against that kind of argument. I think some of the concerns about the Koch Foundation are rooted in some deals that I think were pretty problematic that the Koch Foundation cut with some particular universities. And I think there, though, the complaint ought to be directed toward those university officials as to why they agreed to bad deals that maybe impinged too much on academic freedom. They impinged on questions about how faculty are selected on campuses, for example. There are lots of donors who press universities to accept money with lots of strings attached to them. And some of those strings are unreasonable. And it's up to university leaders to point that out to potential donors about what kinds of strings are reasonable and appropriate to university and which ones are not. And I think right now, there are certainly people who are spending a lot of time complaining about the Koch Foundation for trying to attach some strings to some donations, which I think they've largely moved away from more recently. In part, they've learned their lesson from that. When really it would be more important to direct the fire at university leaders and insist that there are some strings they shouldn't be willing to agree to, regardless of where the money comes from, whether it's coming from libertarian sources or conservative sources, or they're coming from liberal or left-wing sources.
Yeah, there probably are usually a few strings attached whenever money comes into
no question.
A campus, and that's definitely a legitimate and important issue. Keith Whittington's my guest. Keith from Princeton University. We're reaching toward the end of the segment, so tell me a little bit. What are you working on now?
Well, so of course, I just have this book out, Speak Freely, Why Universities Must Defend Free Speech, trying to talk about this campus free speech issue and the importance of intellectual diversity on college campuses. I have a book that I'm trying to move toward coming out on the history of judicial review of congressional statutes from the founding to the period. And I'm working on a new project on the idea of constitutional crisis and sort of informal features of the constitutional system. So how do you maintain a free society, not only by thinking about constitutional rules, but also by thinking about norms and practices and standards of behavior.
Interesting. I should be in touch with you about that. I keep hearing all this rumbling about we're entering into a constitutional crisis because the FBI is raiding President Trump's personal lawyer's office, and now they're bugging his phones. But of course, that's not the constitutional crisis. The constitutional crisis is that Trump paid some hooker 10 years ago. That's the bigger deal. So that's another subject for another day.
There you go.
Anyways, Keith Whittington, I want to thank you for joining me this afternoon.
Thank you.
I'll talk to you soon. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
All right, take care.